Reinforcements have arrived.
Yes, sir. Chew on them. Let's rock.
Yes, of course.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I'm there. Let's rock. Let's rock. Chew on them. I'm there. Chew on them. I'm there. I'm there.
Commander, move out.
Yeah?
Yes, of course. Of course. Of course.
Yes, sir. Let's rock. Let's rock. I'm there. I'm there.
Mission saved.
Yes, move out. Move out. Move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Yes. Of course. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Yes.
Flare detected from the west. A-bomb launch detected. A-bomb
Move out.
launch
Move
detected.
out.
Mission failed. Mission loaded.
Commander, of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out.
Signal flare
Of
detected
course.
from the
Move
west.
out.
A-bomb
Move out.
launch detected.
Of course.
A-bomb launch detected. Mission Mission loaded.
I'm there. Let's rock. Let's rock. Let's rock. Let's rock. I'm there. Let's rock. I'm there. Let's rock. I'm there. I'm there. Let's rock. I'm there. Let's rock. I'm there. I'm there. Let's rock. I'm there. Let's rock. I'm there.
Signal flare detected
I'm
from the
there.
west.
I'm there.
A-bomb
I'm
launch
there.
detected.
Let's rock.
A-bomb
I'm
launch
there.
detected.
Let's rock.
Reinforcements
Chew on
have
it.
arrived.
I'm there. I'm there. Let's rock. I'm there.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting.
Commander?
Affirmative.
Yes. Of course.
Unit mission failed. Mission loaded.
Commander? Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out.
Signal
Of
flare
course.
detected
Move
from the
out.
west. A-bomb launch
Move out.
detected.
Of course.
A-bomb launch
Of
detected.
course. Of course.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Of course. Of course.
Vehicle
Shake it,
reporting.
baby.
Acknowledged.
Yeah? Let's rock.
Yes. Of course.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes. Of course.
Reporting. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. 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 Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Commander? Of course. Move out.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
A-bomb launch
Affirmative.
detected.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Shake
Affirmative.
it, baby. What's up? Let's rock.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yeah? Let's rock. There.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Commander?
Acknowledged.
Commander? Yes. Commander, move out.
Shake it, baby!
Awaiting orders.
Yeah, I'm there. Chew on this!
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Mission saved.
Commander, of course.
Reporting. Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Waiting orders. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
What's up? I'm there. I'm there. I'm there.
Reporting. Vehicle reporting.
Shake it,
Affirmative.
baby.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 At once. Affirmative. At once. Agreed. 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 Very well. Affirmative. Very well. Agreed. At once. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Agreed. Reporting. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Yes, sir. Awaiting orders. Yes, sir. Reporting. Acknowledged.
Yeah? Cha-ching!
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Mission saved.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yeah? I'm there. Let's rock.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Let's rock. I'm there. Let's rock.
Unit lost. Mission loaded.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Ready and waiting. Agreed. Affirmative. 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 Reporting. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Awaiting orders. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Reinforcements
Yes, sir.
have arrived.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Yes. Yes, of course.
Yes, sir. Let's rock.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
What's up? I'm there. Rock. Yeah? I'm there.
Yes, sir.
Yeah? I'm there. I'm there. Let's rock. Let's rock.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Awaiting orders.
What's up?
Agreed. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yeah? Let's rock.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Reporting. Affirmative. Reporting. Yes, sir.
Commander,
Affirmative.
Mission accomplished.
Stavros, you old dog. Have you got any idea what a pain in the ass you are? Well, that's not what I hear. The commander here tells me that he had to assign 3 privates to clean your diapers. General Stavros wishes to offer you his deepest appreciation and congratulations on your brilliant career.